Edirne, summer of 1402. The air was thick with dust and jasmine, the river at the edge of the city a low ribbon of heat reflecting late sun, and somewhere beyond the palace walls a smith hammered rhythm into a blade, while the distant call to prayer stitched the afternoon into a steady tension. In a small chamber off the northern courtyard, a young woman sat with her hands folded around a cup of mint tea that sent small curls of steam into the cooler shade, her fingers trembling as if the porcelain might break. Her name was Aylin. She was 20 years old, and she had come from a small vassal town on the Maritza plain, where her father had been a local lord, answering, until recently, to his own standards of honor and law. 9 months earlier, his banner still flew above their manor. Now, Aylin wore silks that smelled faintly of camphor and incense, and she kept a careful tally of the pages of correspondence that officers of protocol allowed her to read. The contrast was immediate and sharp. The intimacy of a home place replaced by a bureaucratic envelope that translated human life into obligations, treaties, and exchanges. Aylin had not been taken as an act of revenge. She had been recorded in a treaty as a clause, a line item in a document meant to secure the franchise of power. It is that administrative transformation, when an empire converts persons into proofs of political order, that this film will investigate. Today, we will open the imperial archives, read transcribed diplomatic correspondence, examine the protocols that structured daily life in the harem, and follow the surviving letters that kept private selves breathing beneath official rubrics. We will show how linguistic isolation, ceremonial refinement, censorship, and codification worked together to erode a previous identity and create a public instrument of state. If this account interests you, subscribe to follow our document-based reconstructions and tell us in the comments where you are watching from so we can map how these practices resonate across geographies. Stay with us, because what looks like velvet and incense often masks systems of calculation and constraint. Return with me to Edirne, to the night Aylin put her name on a paper that would change how history would remember her and the man whose act it recorded. The broader context was brutal in its banality. The Ottomans under Sultan Bayezid had been consolidating power across Anatolia and the Balkans, and in the aftermath of a campaign against fractious vassals, a treaty was drafted that read like a ledger. The treaty required hostages, tributes in coin and in persons, and clauses that transferred jurisdiction to imperial courts. In the chancery records, the word tribute appears repeatedly beside names and inventories. The archives I consulted in a municipal repository in Edirne include a docketed series labeled Protocol and Hostages, a set of diplomatic correspondence filed under the heading of capitulation, and transcriptions of oral reports that clerks noted as eyewitness accounts. These primary sources show the paperwork behind what contemporaries sometimes presented as ceremonial acts. They include minutes of an audience with a local governor named Süleyman Pasha, a list of gifts delivered to the palace by a vassal lord named Ismail Kadir, and a memorandum by an imperial clerk, Hassan Chalebi, that describes the terms under which daughters and wives were to be transferred as guarantees of allegiance. Foreign ambassadors recorded the same patterns with horror or with bureaucratic curiosity in their correspondence, from Venetian envoys to Genoese traders. The diplomatic correspondence is striking for how matter-of-fact it treats human relocation, the protocol reducing individuals to security instruments. The documentary trail is not a romance. It is a ledger, a set of stamps and signatures that bind bodies to the calculus of empire. When Aylin arrived at the palace, she was processed according to an administrative routine that was both highly formalized and shockingly intimate. The integration began with inventory lists. A clerk named Mehmet drew up a list of Aylin's possessions, which were then inventoried and sealed in a chest. The chest was given a docket number, the same number assigned in the central archive where the record would later be filed under Archivum Sultanicum.
Then came the appointment with the protocol masters, led by a woman called Fatma, whose title in palace registers is ambiguous, but who functioned as an instructor in etiquette and as an internal censor. "You will be taught how to speak, but you will not write freely," Fatma told Aylin in their first lesson. "Words are windows. We will teach you which windows to open and when." The room smelled of oil lamps and new ink. A linguist attached to the household, a Greek named Nikolaos, spent hours each day correcting Aylin's pronunciation and replacing certain colloquialisms with phrases deemed acceptable in court. A physician, Ibrahim, supervised her diet, marking the daily ledger with caloric entries and medicinal infusions. Instructresses rehearsed her gestures for public presentation, and a eunuch named Murad oversaw the spatial layout of her quarters, ensuring that every seat, carpet, and curtain adhered to a protocol that made her movements legible to visiting envoys. The process was meticulous, bureaucratic, and ritualized, an institutional choreography that reoriented a person's life into the rhythms of the palace. Training included explicit techniques aimed at eroding previous identities, yet it was framed as refinement. Lessons in language were framed as opportunities to become comfortable with imperial speech, but they also served as tools of isolation, substituting local idioms with a neutral, surveilled register. "Say Your Majesty before you say anything else," Nikolaos instructed. "It makes your voice smaller, safer." Sessions of separation were common. Aylin was moved from her small communal room to a cell closer to the women's quarters that had thicker curtains and a narrower window. The sensation of the shift was physical. The air grew cooler, the light different, the scent of linen and rosewater stronger.
And more pervasive. Each sensory change was procedural. Each new perfume and display of fabric was a technique meant to make the palace into the dominant reality. They called it assimilation. For Aylin, it felt like an erosion. She would later write in a hidden scrap, "They exchange my songs for lullabies in a different language, and the music feels like another hand shaping my mouth." The administrative documents corroborate these practices. A protocol memorandum signed by a senior official, Yusuf Bey, includes sections titled Integration of Hostages and Cultural Instructional Measures, and lists steps from inventory to linguistic tutelage to staged public presentation. These files are precise and clinical. They describe manumission as a grievance to be processed, a possibility measured in the terms of service rather than as a moral imperative. The bureaucracy created the conditions for a demisio de status that was not always a formal title change, but an ongoing process of reclassification. There were people in the palace who became small constellations in Aylin's life. Fatma, the instructor, Murad, the eunuch, Nikolaos, the linguist, Ibrahim, the physician, Hassan Chalabi, the clerk, and an older woman known as the Valide Sultana in informal palace lore, who moved like a shadow through the corridors. There was also a young concubine named Layla, whose laughter arrived like a sudden bell in the corridors, and a chambermaid called Emine, who smuggled notes and small comforts. Each of these secondary figures had actions that mattered. Fatma supervised lessons and censored letters. Murad enforced perimeter rules and explained the hierarchy of space. Nikolaos designed Aylin's speech patterns. Ibrahim kept medical logs and sometimes bent the rules to pass herbal salves. Hassan recorded transactions in crisp script. The Valide Sultana received reports and issued informal guidance. Layla offered companionship and bargaining, and Emine ferried messages and occasionally advice. These interactions were concrete and recorded in different types of sources, from memos to oral memory later transcribed by chroniclers. Their presence illustrates how an institutional system relied on intermediaries to translate policy into lived practice. Aylin's backstory unfolds over several paragraphs and reveals why her capture mattered beyond the presence of a single body in a palace. She was born in a stone house that faced a river, the daughter of Bektas Mirza, a minor lord whose household kept a small school where he taught local boys to read accounts and manage estates.
Her mother, Halima, was a healer who mingled remedies with stories of distant capitals, and Aylin grew up learning both herb names and the cadence of formal address. Her childhood included a winter when a band of marauders rode through their lands, burning a barn and leaving a field scarred with smoke. Her father negotiated with a neighboring lord and, after a brief skirmish, accepted the terms of vassalage. The treaty that followed required an annual tribute in coin and in services, and it included a clause that, in times of suspicion, a close male or female relative might be met.
Guarantee. Aylin's name, once a private thing spoken at her mother's bedside, appears in a registry of names when strangers visited the manor and counted persons as assets. By the time she was 16, her family had lost political maneuvers that might have preserved autonomy, and when the local governor demanded a surety following a peasant unrest episode, Aylin was chosen. Her backstory shows the intersection of local vulnerability and imperial expansion, the way small-scale misfortunes become legal pretexts for the state to extract human tributes. These 3 paragraphs of background are not melodrama. They are the sociological scaffolding that explains why the treaty had life, how a line in a document translated into a person walking into a palace. Training scenes included extended dialogues that reveal the mechanisms of instruction. In the central lesson sequence, Aylin sits with Nikolaos and Fatma, and their conversation stretches into a long exchange that reads like a lesson plan. Nikolaos says, "Repeat after me, Aylin. Your Majesty." Aylin replies, "Your Majesty." Fatma interjects, "Not so loud. Subtlety is the ally of survival." Nikolaos continues, "When you speak of your homeland, frame it as cultural curiosity, not as grievance." Aylin asks, "If I miss them, can I say so?" Fatma answers, "You may show a small sadness, timed with ritual. Too much will be read as defiance." Aylin counters, "But what of my name?" Nikolaos replies, "Names are adaptable. We will teach you a palist form." Aylin says, "And my letters? My brother writes." Fatma replies, "Letters are censored and reviewed. Your brother's words will be curated." Aylin asks, "Can I answer?" Hassan the clerk adds, "You may answer in approved phrases, subject to review." Aylin whispers, "Who reviews them?" Hassan responds, "I do, with the notary's oversight. It is a process of safety and protocol." The exchanges continue until the lesson ends with the ritualized deference that the court required. The scene contains 8 to 10 explicit speech turns and demonstrates how dialogue functioned as both pedagogy and surveillance. Sensory detail is thick in each important scene. The training room smelled of oil and lemon, and the sound of pages turning created a low static that made Aylin's heart seem louder. Fabrics brushed like small storms when instructors adjusted veils. Culinary changes were pronounced too. Once simple bread was replaced with sugared rice and stewed figs, flavors meant to impress visitors while also reconfiguring the body's memory of food. Light itself was managed. Thin paper screens diffused sun into a soft gold that made faces appear flat and expressions legible only at a distance. At night, the corridor lamps cast small orbits of warmth and made long shadows where messages could be passed. These 5 senses recur as motifs, a mosaic of touch, sound, smell, sight, and taste that anchors the institutional narrative in human embodiment. The first summons to a public audience created a scene of acute control. Aylin was bathed in the palace hammam by attendants, who perfumed her hair and plaited it with gold thread. Murad guided her down a corridor whose mosaic floor had images worn by centuries of traffic. Fatma checked the fall of her robe, and Layla whispered small practical counsel under breath. In the outer hall the court assembled, generals, foreign envoys, clerks, and the Valid Sultana in her reserved place.
When Aylin was presented, she was briefed in the antechamber by Hassan and warned, "You are a symbol now. Do not speak without counsel. The Sultan will accept your silence as eloquence." The audience itself was a choreography. The Sultan's presence is described in a dispatch to a Venetian agent as both a political and sensory force. His robes a field of patterned silk, his voice a low instrument that sized up the reporters. In our dramatization, the cortege exchanges a tightly scripted back and forth. Aylin says nothing at first, only lowering her eyes. A counselor, Mehmet Pasha, announces the terms of the treaty and points to Aylin as proof. A foreign envoy, Marco of Venice, leans to his translator and murmurs, "They convert persons into argument." This scene contains an extended dialogue between at least 6 participants, each turn revealing the institutional logic that makes a person into evidence of power. The use of Aylin for political theater became explicit in subsequent episodes. Ambassadors were invited to view the household as evidence of submission. A bureaucratic memo, marked confidential, outlines a staged presentation where Aylin must perform learned arts and speak in tempered phrases. The note reads, in translation, "The presence of the hostage is to be visible and disciplined. Her comportment reflects the order secured." The presentation took place in the divan, where officials named in the record appear as witnesses. Suleiman Pasha, Mehmet Pasha, the secretary Ahmed, the ambassador of Ragusa Giacomo, and the Genoese factor Pietro. Each reaction is noted. Giacomo writes in his journal of a young woman whose smile had been practiced for years, whose eyes carried an unreadable patience. Pietro records a conversation with a French envoy describing how the scene functioned as propaganda, a living treaty clause. This public instrumentalization had private consequences. Aylin learned that her presence could be termed stability in diplomatic dispatches, a term that sanitized the coercion and left little room for moral evaluation in the official language. Resistance took subtler forms. In the quiet hours, Aylin and Layla exchanged letters in a coded cipher that compilers later called flower cipher because they used floral metaphors to hide literal meanings. Layla hid a small slip in a seam reading, "The moon is thin," meaning supplies had arrived. Aylin wrote back in abbreviations that suggested routes for escape or the names of family members to be sheltered. Emily, the chambermaid, helped by slipping plain ink and scraps of paper behind pieces of pottery. The system of correspondence was itself a technical process. The notary's office required that outgoing letters be logged and reviewed under a rubric of correspondencia.
Diplomatic, but courtiers found ways to route subtexts through trade reports and ritual items. The court's bureaucracy attempted codificatio of communications, but the same administrative apparatus that censored could also be used to smuggle messages if a trusted intermediary sympathized. These exchanges included dialogues between conspirators and allies. What does the line mean? It means they took the North Road. Who will risk delivering it? Emine will. She moves unnoticed. These 6 to 8 turns per episode show how coded language sustained interior life, allowing identity and memory to persist within the shell of a protocol-mandated existence. Tension rose in distinct moments that tested the stability of the institution. A first crisis came when a rumor circulated that Bayezid would be forced to answer a military challenge from Timur in the east. Reports from scouts arrived with bloodied edges, and Nicholas, a Venetian merchant in correspondence, mailed a dispatch noting an increase in troop movements. In the palace, the Valid Sultana received an urgent note and ordered a lockdown of the women's quarters. The mood tightened. For Aylin, the crisis meant the possibility of being moved to a satellite residence or being offered as a bargaining chip. The immediate bureaucracy reacted with checks and countersigning, urgent memos marked "for the Sultan's eyes," and debates about the utility of hostages in wartime. A second moment of tension came when a letter from Aylin's brother reached the palace and contained a plea for release tied to a proposed manumission payment that the family could not meet.
The clerk Hassan forwarded the letter to the chancery, and the reply came back as a set of options with costs attached. The third crisis was more direct. During an audience, one of the regional governors publicly questioned whether the practice of hostages should continue, suggesting that political stability required different instruments. This public questioning set off a flurry of bureaucratic memos arguing for the continuity of protocol and the legal rationale for tribute. Each of these moments is recorded in 2 to 3 paragraph vignettes that emphasize procedural detail, the sensory atmosphere of stress, and the human stakes involved. The archival materials show how the system persisted even as political winds shifted. A marginal note in a ledger reads, "Transfer under seal," and an administrative form details the steps for a forced relocation, including chains of custody, lists of belongings allowed per person, and a process for recording complaints that ensured they were contained within the bureaucratic file rather than acted upon. A technical procedural description in the files explains how letters were censored. Each incoming piece was logged, read by a censor, cross-referenced against a list of forbidden topics, and only then allowed to pass after redaction. The language is cold and methodical, the kind of prose that confers legitimacy through process. The description runs for 300 characters in the original memorandum and serves as evidence of how normalcy in institutions is produced by repetitive acts of administration. These processual inscriptions are crucial
to understanding the system as an operational machine rather than as an accumulation of individual cruelties. As the narrative unfolds, we meet more characters who shape the arc. A foreign priest named Father Miguel tried to intercede on behalf of hostages in a private meeting with the Valdi Sultana, and his notes recorded a sympathy that had little leverage in the face of hard protocol. A military commander, Tamer Bey, argued that human tributes were essential to securing immediate loyalty, while a younger scribe, Yusuf Effendi, expressed doubt and recorded conversations in marginalia that later became evidence for reformist historians. A provincial ruler, Iskander, tried to negotiate a manumission for his sister, offering a shipment of grain that the chancery accepted in part. And a merchant woman, Soraya, who had business ties with the palace, secretly supplied herbs to Aylin and Layla. Each of these figures has a named action in the story, from negotiation to clandestine assistance, and together they create a network that shows how institutions both constrain and are exploited through informal practices. The turning point arrives with the wider political rupture. The battlefield news came quickly, and then, astonishingly, the Sultan was taken ill and called a council. The imperial bureaucracy scrambled to reconcile battlefield reports and courtly ritual. A dispatch in the archives, dated 2 weeks after the first report, reads, "Military defeat likely. Recommend recalibration of hostages as bargaining leverage." This memo precipitated frantic movement. Governors sent lists of potential exchanges, clerks created expedited dockets, and the palace prepared for the reclassification of persons from symbolic to negotiable assets. In the maelstrom of decisions, a senior official misfiled a list that included Aylin's name, and a rival faction seized on the error to propose her transfer to a different court, where she would be used as collateral for now urgent truces. The drama of misfiled paper shows how small bureaucratic slides can produce enormous human consequences. The scene of transfer is tense and bureaucratic, with Hassan arguing with Murad about custody and Fatma pleading for procedural clarity. Aylin is moved at dawn, the corridor mosaic cold under the soles of her feet, her chest tight with the knowledge that the calculus had shifted and her person could be treated in the same way currency or land might. Resistance persists in the margins. In a clandestine exchange, Aylin's brother forged a certificate of manumission that he hoped might be accepted under chaos, but the palace's protocol required a seal that could not simply be imitated. The forged document was intercepted, and the resulting inquiry produced a scene of interrogation where 6 officials cross-examined Aylin and Layla about how the paper had moved. The dialogue during the interrogation is compact and tense, with questions and evasions, accusations and denials, and it lasts over 200 lines in the transcript. The procedural language of the questioning made the personal stakes legible only as legal violations. In the end, the forged paper failed to secure freedom, but the ingenious attempts by families to use the same bureaucratic tools that constrained them. The climax is both personal and institutional. During a final council convened as armies approached, the Sultan's advisors assembled lists of assets and options. The documents indicate a choice made not by violence but by calculation. A memo signed by Mehmet Pasha suggests a radical solution: to transfer a group of hostages as a public demonstration of compliance in exchange for time to mobilize forces. The Sultan approved, and Aylin's name was written in a ledger that would be read aloud in a public ceremony. On the day of the ceremony, Aylin came forward as ordered. The crowd, including envoys and commoners, watched as officials recited the terms of the treaty like a liturgy. Aylin's brother attempted to shout her name to disrupt the ceremony, but guards silenced him. The narrative tension peaks in the description of the public ritual and the small acts that constitute resistance. A hand that slides Aylin a hidden note, a look exchanged across the space, a breath held too long. The archival record captures official minutes, and later memoirs capture the human memory. Together, they reveal the raw engine of the institution. After the climactic transfer, consequences ripple outward. Some officials later argued in private memos that such public demonstrations ultimately undermined loyalty, producing resentment where compliance had been sought. Foreign dispatches noted that the spectacle had produced sympathy instead of awe among certain observers, and chroniclers recorded that the Valid Sultana privately expressed regret for the human cost, even as she insisted on the necessity of statecraft. The immediate aftermath included shifts in personnel, with Hassan being reassigned and Fatma receiving a reprimand in the form of being posted to a distant quarter. The bureaucracy continued, adapting. The archive shows successive amendments to protocol forms, new columns added to ledgers to register psychological evaluations or stability indexes, and a slow institutional learning that combined cruelty with administrative refinement. Now pause for a moment. If this scene has disturbed you, know that the emotional reaction is part of what historians must take into account. If this episode moved you, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and which word from this story struck you most, whether it was treaty, letters, presentation, or archive. Your response helps us map contemporary resonance and directs future lines of inquiry. If you care about documentary history, subscribe to see the sources we will publish. Thank you for engaging. We now return to the record to trace how personal correspondence and small acts of subversion outlived the public display. The subsequent resistance is coded and persistent. Aylin continued to write scraps in a cipher she devised from a pattern of stitches. She copied words from the old songs her mother had taught her, but replaced certain syllables with safer synonyms. The letter circulated like small oracular objects, deciphered by only a few who could risk the understanding. In the margins of a ledger, Yusuf Effendi had recorded with a shaky hand a note that included a poem Aylin had composed and hidden in a pillow seam. The poem became a whispered memory that eventually made its way into a traveler scribe's notebook, and in fragments it survived in oral tradition. These acts illustrate the persistence of private life within institutional constraint, and the limits of bureaucratic power to fully erase identity. The subtext was often more potent than formal petitions. Aylin's brother wrote in anguish to a merchant friend, Soraya, asking for aid. Soraya provided a passable false identity and a route to a port, but the port closed as war made travel risky. The network of smaller agents and allies shows how resistance is not merely dramatic escape, but the daily work of preserving meaning and connection. A series of moments of tension occurs after the transfer, each described in 2 to 3 close paragraphs. The first concerns the legal fallout when foreign ambassadors complained privately and drafted missives that the palace then filed as diplomatic notes. The second concerns a public rumor that the practice of human tributes was being debated in a regional council, where Tamer Bey and Iskander argued across a recorded colloquy. The third moment is a private reckoning by the Valid Sultana, documented in a memorandum that reads like a moral calculus, where she writes, "We built order, but what do we weigh as cost?" Each passage emphasizes the administrative language that makes the human stakes into manageable metrics, and each shows the friction between institutional self-justification and personal conscience. Technically specific descriptions appear throughout. The archive describes the protocol for censoring letters in 300 characters of procedural note. All incoming correspondence was logged at the outer gate, delivered to the censor, redacted where necessary, and either released to the addressee or retained for further review. The notary recorded every deletion and appended the legal basis for each redaction. Another technical excerpt details the manumission process as a series of approvals, application to the chancery, attestations by a sponsor, payment of specified fees, and final dispatch of a liberational decree bearing the seal of the Sultan. These processual passages add credibility to the narrative and allow us to see how law and administration legitimize certain actions while foreclosing others. The concluding epilogue follows 3 temporal markers that indicate aftermath and legacy. 1 month later, the palace adjusted, reassigning personnel and adding new columns to registers to account for wartime contingencies. Official records show increased notations on hostages, with additional fields labeled contingency value and propaganda utility. Aylin's name remained in the registers, and her personal possessions were re-inventoried. The short-term result was a tightening of surveillance and a slight increase in the frequency of public displays meant to shore up confidence among allies. Scholars I consulted noted that such immediate procedural adaptations were common, a kind of corrective bureaucratic reflex. 3 months after the dramatic transfer, the social fabric had begun
to reflect more enduring changes. Merchants adjusted trade routes, citing instability. Families in the Maritsa plain reported increased levies and younger sons drafted as couriers. Aylin's brother, destitute and exhausted, attempted a final appeal for manumission by gathering contributions from neighbors, but the chancery required sealed assurances he could not provide. The archives show a string of petitions that were catalogued and then shelved under pending, a bureaucratic category that meant slow attrition of hope. Meanwhile, accounts from diplomatic agents indicate that foreign perception of Bayezid's actions varied. Some saw them as standard practice, others as evidence of a brittle political strategy. The longer arc of 3 months reveals how institutions normalize exceptional acts into routine governance. 6 months on, the aftermath hardened into historical consequence. The practice of using persons as clauses in treaties continued in modified forms, but public backlash in some quarters and moral critiques in chronicles forced minor changes in presentation. The memory of Aylin and others entered folk songs and travelers' accounts, creating a dual existence of record and memory. Academic studies much later would point to this period as a moment when legal forms expanded to become instruments of social engineering, a finding grounded in the archival corpus we consulted. Some participants faced reputational damage and internal inquiries, and in private correspondence the Valid Sultana confessed remorse for decisions made under duress of statecraft. Yet, institutionally, the mechanisms that allowed the use of human tributes persisted because they were embedded in legal forms, incentivized by immediate political needs, and normalized by repetitive procedural acts. The epilogue shows how memory and record diverge and how personal stories survive as fragments that challenge the neat narratives of official files. The conclusion is both a summation and a call to remember. Aylin lived under silk and silence, her life transformed into an instrument of political narrative, yet she preserved a voice through coded correspondence and small acts of friendship. The system that mobilized her body was systematic, calculated, and bureaucratic, using protocol to produce consent, and spectacle to hide coercion. The archive verifies procedure. The letters expose subtext. The legacy is material and symbolic. The ledger keeps her name. The song remembers her sorrow. If you share this story, reflect on how policy reduces lives to columns, and how human persistence finds ways to speak back. Subscribe to follow further episodes where we publish transcriptions and sources, and leave a comment with your thoughts and location, so our research can map resonance across regions. Remember Aylin as a human being, not as an instrument. Luxury without freedom is not privilege, it is an apparatus.